The year 1888 breathed a heat that felt ancient and unforgiving. Out here, the West wasn't a promise. It was a test. The sun, a relentless hammer of white gold, beat down upon the plains, baking the grasses to the color of old bone. The wind, when it came, offered no relief. It was a hot, dry breath that scoured the land, picking up the fine red dust and swirling it into ghostly funnels that danced and died on the horizon. It was a landscape of stark truths. Life was hard, water was precious, and silence was the most common language. The only sound that truly belonged to this place was the distant, lonely caw of a crow, a jagged tear in the vast, empty fabric of the sky. This was the world of Elias Thorne. His ranch was little more than a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the base of a low, rocky mesa, as if seeking shelter from the sheer immensity of the land. A small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his father, a barn that leaned ever so slightly to the north, and a web of corrals stitched together with sweat and determination. It wasn't much, but it was his. At 32, Elias wore the land on his face. His skin was tanned the color of worn leather, creased at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He was a man of few words, his movements economical and deliberate, shaped by a life of solitary labor. The silence of the ranch had deepened in the 2 years since his father's death. The official story was a hunting accident, a trip, a fall, a rifle that discharged at the worst possible moment. But the story never sat right with Elias. His father had known rifles better than he knew his own hands. He was a man who moved through the wilderness with a quiet, certain grace. Accidents didn't happen to men like that. The unanswered questions settled in the quiet corners of the cabin, a constant, low hum beneath the noise of the wind. Elias lived with them, just as he lived with the dust and the heat. He asked for little and expected even less, finding a grim sort of peace in the rhythm of his work, rising before the sun, tending a small herd of cattle, mending fences that the wind and beasts were forever trying to reclaim. His life was a straight, narrow path, predictable and blessedly uncomplicated, until the day the dust on the horizon resolved itself into a tired buckboard wagon, drawn by a horse that looked one step from collapse. Elias watched it approach from the shade of the porch, his hand resting on the well-worn handle of the axe leaning against the cabin wall. Strangers were rare, and rarely a good omen. As the wagon drew closer, he recognized the slump of the driver's shoulders. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. It was his sister, Clara. He hadn't seen her in 4 years, not since she'd married a smooth-talking hardware salesman from back east and moved 100 miles away, chasing a life of supposed comfort and society. She pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard, the creak of the wheels a groan of pure exhaustion. She didn't move, just sat there, her face hidden by a dusty bonnet. Behind her, 3 small, tow-headed boys peered out from a jumble of blankets and meager possessions, their eyes wide and frightened. Elias walked slowly toward her, his boots scuffing in the dirt. "Clara?" he said, his voice rough from disuse. She finally looked up, and the sight of her face struck him like a physical blow. The cheerful, rosy-cheeked girl he remembered was gone. In her place was a woman worn thin by hardship, her eyes hollowed out and her mouth set in a grim, tight line. Her dress, once a fine blue calico, was faded and stained. "He's gone, Elias," she said, her voice a dry whisper, devoid of tears. There was nothing left to cry with. "Took up with another woman, some dancer from a traveling show. Sold the business, the house, everything. Left us with the wagon, the horse, and $20. Elias stood there, motionless, the hot wind whipping strands of her hair around her face. He looked from her drawn face to the 3 small boys huddled in the back. The oldest, maybe 7, held a protective arm around the 5-year-old, who was clutching a faceless rag doll. The youngest, no more than 3, had a thumb stuck in his mouth, his gaze fixed on Elias with a solemn, unblinking stare. This was a complication he could not have imagined. His world was built for one. His supplies were measured for one. The small cabin, the meager income from his cattle, the very silence he depended on. None of it was meant for this. A woman and 3 small children. It was an impossibility. He saw the flicker of desperation in Clara's eyes, the silent plea she was too proud to speak. She had come here as a last resort. He was all she had left. He thought of his father, of the unwavering sense of duty that had been the man's compass. Family was family. You didn't turn your back, no matter the cost. He let out a long, slow breath, the air burning his lungs. "Get down, Clara," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "The boys, too. You all look like you could use some water, and a roof that doesn't move." It was not a warm welcome, but it was an acceptance. He saw the tension leave his sister's shoulders, a slight sagging as if a rope she'd been clinging to had finally been secured. He helped her down from the wagon, her body feeling frail and bird-like in his hands. He lifted the boys out one by one, their small, dusty bodies strangely heavy in his arms. He was clumsy with them, unaccustomed to their size, their fidgeting, their silent appraisal of him. The ranch, once his sanctuary of solitude, was instantly transformed. The quiet was shattered by the nervous chatter of the boys, the rustle of Clara trying to make a home out of a corner of his cabin, the constant, unspoken presence of 4 other souls. Elias felt like a stranger in his own life. He was exhausted, overwhelmed, and his already thin resources were stretched to the breaking point. After a week, the flour was low, the salted pork was nearly gone, and the children's pale faces were a constant reminder of their needs. There was no choice. He had to go to town. The town of Harmony Creek was a 20-mile ride away, a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings shimmering in the heat. To Elias, it was a necessary evil. He disliked the prying eyes, the gossip that flew like locusts from the saloon to the general store, the way everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. He hitched his horse in front of Miller's general store, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. He was making his way through his list: flour, beans, coffee, salt, when he saw her. She was standing at the far end of the counter, speaking in a low voice to Mr. Miller, whose face was a mask of strained politeness. She was a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, with hair the color of dark honey pulled back in a simple knot. Even in a plain, faded dress, there was an undeniable beauty about her, a grace in the way she held herself. But it was a beauty edged with sorrow. There was a haunted, watchful quality in her deep green eyes, and a palpable air of isolation surrounded her, as if she were standing in a glass box only she could feel. Elias had seen her before, from a distance. June, her name was June Abbott, the widow. As she turned to leave, the 2 women who had been examining bolts of cloth nearby fell silent. They watched her go, their eyes hard with judgment. As the door jingled shut behind her, their whispers started, sharp and venomous. "The nerve of her, showing her face in broad daylight," one of them muttered. "Shameless is what it is," the other agreed. "After what she did, drove that poor man to his end." Elias kept his back to them, pretending to inspect a barrel of nails, but he listened. He knew the story. Everyone in Harmony Creek did. June's husband, a farmer named Thomas Abbott, had been found in his barn a year ago, dead from a shotgun blast. The sheriff had ruled it an accident, just like Elias's father, but the town had written its own verdict. The rumor was that Thomas had found his wife in a compromising position with a native man from a nearby tribe. The story, fueled by prejudice and self-righteous piety, was that the shame had driven him to take his own life. There was never any proof, no witnesses, nothing but the vicious current of gossip. But in a town like Harmony Creek, gossip was as good as fact. June Abbott was branded a pariah. She lived in a small, dilapidated shack on the edge of town, near the old abandoned well, keeping to herself and raising her young son in the shadow of the town's contempt. Elias paid for his provisions, his mind heavy. He loaded the sacks onto his horse, the weight of them a familiar comfort. As he prepared to ride out, he saw her again. June was walking down the dusty main street, heading toward the edge of town. She was holding the hand of a small boy, who couldn't have been much older than Clara's youngest. He didn't mean to follow. Not really. He just happened to be going in the same direction, his horse's pace slow and measured. He kept his distance, watching her from under the brim of his hat. He saw the way other townsfolk gave her a wide berth, the way women pulled their children closer as she passed. She seemed not to notice, her gaze fixed straight ahead, her back ramrod straight. It was a posture of defiance, or perhaps of a woman who had simply learned to endure. She passed the last building in town and continued along the rutted track that led out toward the plains. Elias saw her destination, the old stone well that had run dry years ago, now just a crumbling monument to better times. A single, gnarled cottonwood grew beside it, offering a sliver of shade. She sat on the low stone wall, pulling her son into her lap. Elias reined in his horse behind a thicket of mesquite, feeling like a trespasser. He watched as she spoke to the boy, her face softening in a way he hadn't seen in the store. She pointed up at a hawk circling in the sky, and the boy laughed, a small, bright sound in the oppressive stillness. Just then, a strong gust of wind swept across the plains, a sudden, violent exhalation from the land. It tore at their clothes, whipping dust into the air. The wind caught the hem of June's dress, lifting the thin fabric up around her knees, and Elias saw it. Fading but still visible against the pale skin of her thigh was the unmistakable pattern of old bruises, a sickening mosaic of yellow and purple, the ghost of a terrible impact. It wasn't just one mark, it was a cluster, the kind of injury that didn't come from a simple fall. It spoke of cruelty, of violence, delivered in anger. The wind died down as quickly as it had come. June smoothed her dress, unaware that she had been observed. She hugged her son close, her cheek resting on the top of his head, a gesture of fierce, protective love. Elias sat on his horse, hidden by the mesquite, the world shifting slightly on its axis. The town's story was neat and simple, a tale of a faithless woman and a shamed husband. It was a story that made them feel righteous in their condemnation. But the bruises told a different story. They whispered of a secret pain, of a violence hidden behind a closed door. They didn't fit the town's narrative. He thought of the look in her eyes in the store, not shame, but a deep, weary sorrow. He thought of the way she held her son, like he was the only anchor she had in the world. He thought of his own father, and the story that never quite added up. Slowly, quietly, he turned his horse around and headed back toward the ranch. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in strokes of orange and blood red. For the first time, Elias Thorne looked at the harsh, unforgiving land around him and wondered how many other untold stories were buried beneath the dust. The question of what had truly happened to the widow June Abbott settled in his mind, a single, stubborn seed of doubt planted in the barren soil of his certainty. He had a feeling it was a question that would not let him rest. The quiet of the ranch was a memory. In its place was a constant, churning chaos that Elias felt deep in his bones. The small cabin, which had always felt spacious enough for one man, now seemed to shrink with each passing day, crowded with the restless energy of his sister and her 3 boys. Clara, bless her heart, tried. She rose with him at dawn, her face pale and determined, and set about trying to impose order on a world ruled by the whims of children. But it was a losing battle. For every corner she swept, a trail of muddy boot prints would appear. For every dish she washed, a cup of milk would be spilled. The boys, Samuel, Jacob, and little Caleb, were not malicious, but they were a force of nature, a small whirlwind of scraped knees, loud arguments over wooden soldiers, and sticky handprints that appeared on every surface. The air, once filled only with the scent of coffee and wood smoke, now carried the smells of sour milk and wet wool. Elias found his solitude shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. He'd come in from a long day of mending fences, his muscles aching and his mind seeking the blessed emptiness of evening, only to be met with a barrage of noise. Caleb would be crying, Jacob would be shouting, and Samuel, the oldest, would be trying to mediate with the self-importance of a 7-year-old general, only making things louder. Clara would be standing in the middle of it all, a wooden spoon in her hand and a look of sheer, bone-deep exhaustion on her face that mirrored his own. He began to feel a fraying at the edges of his patience. The work on the ranch was demanding enough for one man. Now, it felt impossible. His focus was constantly broken by a cry from the cabin or the need to break up a fight that had spilled into the yard. His reserves, both physical and financial, were dwindling at an alarming rate. He was tired in a way he had never known, a weariness that settled not just in his muscles, but in his spirit. He needed help. The thought was a foreign and unwelcome one. He had never needed anyone. But as he looked at Clara's increasingly gaunt face and the wild, untamed energy of his nephews, he knew it was the truth. His mind, against his will, drifted back to the woman by the well, June Abbott. He remembered the quiet dignity with which she'd faced the town's scorn, and the faded bruises that told a story no one else seemed willing to hear. The next time he rode into Harmony Creek, he lingered. After buying his supplies, he tied his horse outside the saloon. He wasn't a drinking man, but it was where men talked. He ordered a beer he didn't want and listened. He brought her name up casually, a carefully placed stone dropped into the murky pond of town gossip. "Saw that Abbott widow the other day," he said to the bartender, a heavy-set man named Hank. "Seems to be keeping to herself." Hank snorted as he wiped down the bar with a grimy rag. "Best for everyone if she does. That woman's poison, thorn. Bad luck follows her like a shadow." A rancher nursing a whiskey at the end of the bar chimed in, his voice thick with liquor and self-righteousness. "Poison's the word. Drove poor Thomas to it. She did. A man can only take so much shame." The consensus was swift and brutal. She was dangerous, a temptress, a woman of loose morals who had consorted with an Indian and brought ruin upon her husband. The words were always the same, a well-rehearsed chorus of condemnation. Elias listened, his face impassive, but a cold anger coiled in his gut. They spoke with such certainty, these men, as if they had been witnesses in the Abbott's bedroom, as if they had held the shotgun in Thomas's hands. Disgusted, he left the saloon and walked back toward his horse. He took the long way, his path leading him past the edge of town, toward the old well. An old woman sat on a rocking chair on the porch of the last shack before the open plains, a patchwork quilt across her lap despite the heat. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and her eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and missed nothing. She was Martha, a woman who had lived in Harmony Creek longer than the town had a name. She watched him approach, her rocking chair creaking rhythmically. "They fill in your head with stories in there. Elias Thorne?" she asked, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Elias stopped, resting a hand on the hitching post. "They're talking." "They're always talking," she said. "Talk is cheap, and they've got plenty of it to spare. You're asking about the girl, June." It wasn't a question. Elias nodded slowly. "Just wondering." Martha's gaze drifted toward the dilapidated shack a few hundred yards away, the one that belonged to June. "You want to know the truth? That girl is kinder than any soul in this town. Her only sin was trusting the wrong man. Thomas Abbott wasn't a saint, no matter what they say in that saloon. He had a temper like a trapped badger and a soul soured by whiskey." She paused, her eyes finding Elias's again. "She's a good woman who's been handed a bad life. That's all." Her words settled the matter in his mind. He thanked her and rode away, the town's ugly whispers fading behind him, replaced by the old woman's quiet, certain testimony. A few days later, he found himself riding toward that very shack. He carried an empty basket in his hand, a flimsy excuse taking shape in his mind. He reined in his horse a short distance away and walked the rest of the way, his heart thumping a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. The place was even more desolate up close. The wood was gray and splintered, the roof patched with a rusty tin, and the small yard was swept bare, devoid of even a single weed. Yet there was a sense of order to the poverty, a cleanliness that spoke of a stubborn pride. He knocked on the door, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. It opened a crack, and June's face appeared in the gap. Her green eyes were wide with alarm and suspicion. "Mr. Thorne?" "Ma'am," he said, feeling a clumsy oath. He held up the basket. I was wondering if you had any eggs to sell. My sister, she's got 3 boys, and they eat more than a pack of coyotes." Her expression didn't change. She looked from his face to the basket and back again, a silent calculation happening behind her eyes. He knew she could see right through his pretense. Everyone knew he had his own chickens. I don't have many," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Anything would help," he insisted, his own voice sounding too loud, too rough. She hesitated for a long moment, her hand white-knuckled on the edge of the door. He was about to turn and leave, to spare her any more discomfort, when she finally pulled the door open. "Come in," she said quietly, "while I look." He stepped inside, removing his hat. The interior was just one room, and it was as sparse as the yard outside. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a rough spun blanket folded neatly upon it. A small, scoured table with 2 chairs stood in the center. In the corner, a makeshift bed on the floor belonged to her son. There were no pictures, no curtains, no softness of any kind, but it was impeccably clean. The floorboards scrubbed pale and the air smelling faintly of soap and wild herbs. It was a cold, lonely space, but it was a home. She didn't speak as she gathered a half-dozen eggs and carefully placed them in his basket. He paid her, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. Her skin was cool, and she pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned. He thanked her and left, feeling the weight of her suspicious gaze on his back until he was gone. 2 weeks later, the weather turned. A cold, wet front blew in from the north, bringing a miserable, chilling rain that turned the ranch to mud. And with the cold came sickness. It started with Caleb, then spread to Jacob and Samuel. A deep, barking cough and a fever that left them weak and listless. Then Clara caught it. For her, it was worse. Already worn down by hardship and exhaustion, her body had no fight left. She lay on her cot, shivering under a mountain of blankets, her breathing shallow and ragged. Elias was frantic. He brewed teas from the herbs his father had taught him to use, but nothing seemed to touch the fever. He was a man who could set a bone or stitch a wound, but this was an enemy he couldn't see, and it was stealing his sister from him. He was sitting by her side, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth, when a soft knock came at the door. He opened it to find June Abbott standing on his porch, a heavy shawl wrapped around her head and shoulders against the driving rain. In her hands, she held a small cloth bundle. "I heard the boys were sick," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the sound of the storm. "And your sister?" Elias was too stunned to speak. "I brought some things," she continued, seeming to take his silence as permission. She stepped inside, her eyes immediately finding Clara on the cot. She moved to her side without a word, placing a cool hand on Clara's forehead. "The fever is high." She unwrapped her bundle on the table. Inside were dried roots and leaves he didn't recognize. She moved about his kitchen with a quiet efficiency, starting a fire, crushing the herbs with a stone, adding them to a pot of water and cornmeal. As the mixture simmered, it filled the cabin with a clean, medicinal aroma. For the next hour, she worked in silence. She coaxed a few spoonfuls of the warm, herbal porridge into each of the boys, who took it without protest. Then she sat by Clara, patiently feeding her small sips, wiping her mouth, her movements gentle and sure. Elias watched her, a profound sense of awe and shame washing over him. This woman, whom his town had cast out, had come through a storm to help his family, asking for nothing in return. She possessed a quiet strength that made the loud condemnations of the men in the saloon seem pathetic and small. By nightfall, Clara's fever had broken. Her breathing was easier, and she had fallen into a deep, healing sleep. June checked on the boys one last time, then gathered her things to leave. "I don't know how to thank you," Elias said, standing by the door. She just nodded, pulling her shawl tight. "Keep them warm. Make more of the porridge in the morning." And then she was gone, disappearing back into the rainy darkness. The next day, Clara was sitting up, weak but lucid. Elias was telling her what had happened. She looked at him, her eyes clear and serious. "Elias," she said, her voice still raspy, "that is a good woman, a woman who has been hurt and is afraid, but she is good to her core." She reached out and took his rough hand. "She's a woman worth trying for again." Clara's words echoed Martha's, and they settled deep inside him. He started to see June not as a tragic figure, but as a person of immense fortitude. He thought of her gentle hands, her determined eyes, her quiet resilience in the face of a cruel world. He felt a pull toward her, a protective instinct that was entirely new to him. He couldn't offer her words. He wasn't a man who knew how. So he offered what he could. He knew she had to gather her own firewood, a back-breaking task. So, late one night, after Clara and the boys were asleep, he loaded his arms with split logs from his own woodpile and carried them through the darkness to her shack. He stacked them neatly and quietly on her small porch and was gone before the moon had risen. He did it again the next night, and the night after that. It was a silent conversation, a gesture he hoped she would understand. The cold rains of autumn eventually gave way to the sharp, biting winds of winter. One evening, the first snow began to fall. Not a blizzard, but a soft, steady dusting of white that blanketed the harsh landscape, muffling all sound and making the world feel clean and new. Something shifted in Elias. He couldn't explain it, but the sight of the falling snow felt like a sign. He pulled on his heavy coat and walked out of the cabin, telling Clara he was just checking on the stock. But his feet did not carry him to the barn. They carried him through the silent, swirling snow, along the familiar path to June Abbott's home. A soft, yellow light glowed in her single window. He stood in the darkness for a long time, watching the snowflakes melt on his coat, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He thought about turning back, about the foolishness of what he was doing. But then he thought of her strength, her kindness, and the profound loneliness he sensed in her. He walked up onto her small porch, his boots making no sound in the fresh snow. He knocked softly. The door opened, and she stood there, silhouetted by the lamplight. She saw him, and her eyes widened. A mixture of fear and confusion. The ever-present stack of firewood was just a few feet from where he stood. She knew. He took off his hat, the snow falling on his hair. He looked at her, at the weary lines around her eyes and the strength in her jaw, and the words came to him, simple and honest. "Will you let me try for you?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper against the silence of the snow. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken questions and years of pain. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the instinct to close the door and retreat into her safe, lonely world. But then he saw something else, a glimmer of hope, faint but persistent. She didn't answer with words. She didn't have to. Instead, she stepped back, pulling the door open wider, a silent invitation to come in out of the cold. For the first time, he stepped over the threshold, bringing a swirl of cold air and fine, white snow in with him. The door closed with a soft click, shutting out the storm and sealing them in a sudden, Profound silence. The small cabin was illuminated by a single kerosene lamp on the table and the restless, dancing light from a small fire in the hearth. Her son was asleep on his floor pallet in the corner, a small mound under a threadbare quilt, his breathing the only other sound. The air was thick with unspoken things. This was a boundary crossed, a line stepped over that could not be unseen. Elias stood awkwardly in the center of the room, his large frame seeming to overwhelm the small space. He held his hat in both hands, turning the brim over and over, a nervous gesture so unlike him. June didn't speak. She moved to the hearth, adding a small piece of wood to the fire from the pile he had left on her porch. It was a silent acknowledgement, a thank you that needed no words. "You should sit down," she said finally, her voice low, "before you melt snow all over the floor." He nodded, moving to one of the two simple chairs at the table. He watched as she went to a small stove, her movements efficient and contained. She poured water from a bucket into a small tin pot and set it to warm, her back to him. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was not an empty silence, but one filled with a heavy, waiting quality. He could hear the hiss of the snow against the single window pane, the crackle and pop of the fire, the steady rhythm of his own heart. She brought 2 tin cups to the table and spooned some dried leaves into each one, a simple herbal tea. When she poured the hot water, the steam rose between them, fragrant and warm. She pushed 1 cup toward him. As he reached for it, his large, calloused fingers brushed against hers. It was a jolt, a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the tea. They both pulled their hands back as if startled. Their eyes met across the table for a long, breathless moment. In the flickering firelight, he saw the deep, weary sorrow in her gaze. But beneath it, something else flickered to life, a cautious curiosity, a question. He had asked to try for her, and this was the beginning of the test. He wrapped his hands around the warm cup, looking down into the dark liquid. "My father," he began, the words feeling rusty in his throat. "He taught me how to track, how to read the land, but he never taught me how to read people. I'm not good with them." June cradled her own cup, her gaze fixed on the fire. "Sometimes there's nothing worth reading," she said quietly. The simple, bitter truth of her words hung in the air. He felt a sudden urge to fill the space between them with honesty, to offer a piece of his own brokenness in exchange for a glimpse of hers. "There was a woman, once," he said, the admission costing him a great deal. "Years ago, before I took over the ranch full-time, her father was a banker back east, sent her out here for a summer to broaden her horizons." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "She thought it was all a grand adventure, the big sky, the cowboys. She liked the idea of me, the rough, quiet man of the land." He fell silent, remembering the sting of it. "I was a fool. I thought it was real. I was saving, planning to build a bigger house. I wrote to her when she went back home. Her father wrote back, a short, polite letter informing me that she was engaged to be married to a man who was a partner in his bank." He took a slow sip of the tea. "She never wanted me. She wanted a story to tell her friends. After that, I decided the silence of this land was better company than the lies people tell." He had laid his small, pathetic story bare. He expected nothing from her, perhaps a polite nod. Instead, after a long silence, she spoke to the fire, her voice so low he had to lean forward to hear it. "My husband, Thomas," she began, her knuckles white around her cup. "He wasn't the man I married. Or maybe he was, and I was just too young and foolish to see it." She took a shaky breath. "The first time he hit me, I was carrying David. He was drunk. He said I'd looked at the blacksmith for too long in town. He was sorry the next day. He brought me wildflowers." The fire crackled, spitting a cinder onto the hearth. Elias felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. He didn't move, didn't breathe, afraid the slightest sound would stop her. "The apologies, They stopped after a while. She continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting a story that had happened to someone else. It didn't take much to set him off, the stew being too salty, the boy crying in the night. He had a darkness in him, a rage that was always simmering right under his skin. Her gaze remained fixed on the flames, but he could see them reflected in her eyes, two tiny fires dancing in a sea of green. He would have his way with me, even when I was sick or tired or heavy with child. It was his right, he said. I was his property. Like the land, like his horse. The stark horror of her words filled the small cabin. More chilling than the snowstorm raging outside, he finally understood the bruises he had seen, the haunted look in her eyes, the wall she kept between herself and the world. It wasn't shame. It was survival. He looked at this small, slender woman and saw a strength that dwarfed his own. She had endured a private hell, and she was still here, still raising her son, still finding the courage to help a sick neighbor. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the air charged with their shared confessions. There were no words of pity or comfort. Their pains were too deep for such simple remedies. Instead, there was a quiet, profound understanding. They were two broken people, sitting in a small, warm room while the world outside was cold and white. He watched the firelight trace the lines of her face, the gentle curve of her cheek, the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw not the town's pariah, but a woman of incredible resilience, a woman who had been grievously wronged. Slowly, the fire began to die down, the shadows in the room growing longer. Elias knew it was time to go. He pushed his chair back, the scraping sound loud in the quiet room. June looked up at him, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. He walked around the table and stood before her. He wanted to reach out, to touch her face, to offer some physical comfort, but he saw the fear that was never far from the surface, the instinct to flinch from a man's touch. He understood that trust, for her, was a fragile thing. A seed that had to be planted in barren ground and nurtured with patience. To rush would be to kill it before it could even sprout. So, he did not touch her face, or her hands. He simply reached out and gently, briefly, laid his hand on her shoulder. It was a gesture of solidarity, of respect. "Thank you for the tea, June," he said softly. He turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. Then, on an impulse, he shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat. He draped it over the back of her empty chair. "The wind is sharp," he said, not looking at her. "You might need this for the morning." And then he was gone, stepping out into the swirling snow, leaving the warmth of the cabin behind. He walked back to the ranch with the cold biting at him through his thin shirt, but he barely felt it. A different kind of warmth was spreading through his chest, a feeling so foreign he didn't have a name for it yet. The next day, the sun came out, glittering on a world transformed by snow. The air was crisp and clean. Elias was splitting wood in the yard, the rhythmic thud of the axe a comfort. When he saw a figure walking toward the ranch from the direction of town, it was June. She was wearing his coat. It was far too big for her. The sleeves rolled up, but she wore it as if it belonged to her. She came not to the cabin, but to the yard where the boys were attempting to build a lopsided snowman. She knelt, showing them how to pack the snow into firm, round balls. Her voice soft, her smile, when it came, a small, fragile thing that lit up her whole face. Clara came to stand beside Elias, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, I'll be," she whispered, a genuine smile on her own face for the first time in weeks. June stayed for hours. She seemed to know instinctively what the wild, restless boys needed. She drew letters for them in the snow with a stick, turning it into a game. She told them a story about a clever coyote and a foolish jackrabbit that had them howling with laughter. For the first time since their arrival, the chaos in the cabin was replaced by a joyful, directed energy. The sound of their laughter was a balm on Elias's frayed nerves. He found himself watching June, the way her face softened when she was with the children, the patience in her hands, the quiet strength that radiated from her like warmth from a stove. Later in the afternoon, while the boys were finally napping and Clara was resting inside, Elias and June stood in the yard, the melting snow dripping from the eaves of the barn. The silence between them was comfortable now, easy. He looked out at the vast, white expanse of the plains, then back at her. The question that had been weighing on him finally surfaced. "June," he said, his voice low, "if I want to do the right thing, can it be wrong?" He was asking about them, about what the town would say, about the trouble that would surely come from him, a solitary rancher, associating with the outcast widow. He was asking if pursuing the cautious hope in his heart was a foolish, reckless thing to do. She looked up at him, her green eyes clear and unwavering. The wind lifted a strand of her honey-colored hair, and she tucked it back behind her ear. Her answer was soft, but it carried the weight of a hard-won truth. "Don't do the right thing, Elias," she whispered. "Do what's necessary." Her words cut through all his doubts, all the noise of the town's judgment. What is necessary? It was the law of the West, the creed of survivors. You did what was necessary to live, to endure, to find a scrap of warmth in a cold world. She was giving him permission. More than that, she was showing him the way. He looked down at her, at the dusting of freckles across her nose, at the quiet courage in her eyes, and he knew what was necessary. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and closed her eyes. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not of fire and demand. It was slow, tentative, and deeply poignant. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a prayer. It tasted of the cold, clean air, of unshed tears, and of a fragile, heartbreaking hope. It was a kiss that acknowledged all the pain that had come before, and all the trouble that would surely lie ahead. But it chose this moment, this connection. Anyway, it was the first kiss, and for both of them, it felt like the first true breath they had taken in a very long time. A man and a woman walking together in a town like Harmony Creek was an event. A man like Elias Thorne and a woman like June Abbott walking together was a declaration. It began subtly. He needed supplies. And she, having run out of flour, asked if she might ride along in his wagon. It was a simple, practical arrangement. But as they walked down the dusty main street from the general store to the blacksmith's, Elias felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. The change in the town's atmosphere was as real as a shift in the wind. Conversations on the boardwalk would falter and die as they approached, only to resume in venomous whispers the moment they passed. He saw the men loafing on the porch of the saloon stop their whittling, their gazes following June with a familiar, predatory mix of contempt and curiosity. They nudged each other, their mouths twisting into sneers. Elias didn't need to hear the words. He knew them by heart. The old, ugly stories were being dragged out, dusted off, and given new life. He felt June flinch beside him, her shoulders tightening, her gaze dropping to the dusty ground. He instinctively moved closer, his arm brushing hers, a silent message of solidarity that did nothing to stop the tide of malice. He loaded their supplies into the wagon with a grim, deliberate slowness, his own anger a cold, hard stone in his gut. The town's poison followed them home. It seeped into the air at the ranch, a tension that settled over their small, fragile peace. June grew quieter, the brief flicker of hope in her eyes dimmed by the resurgence of public scorn. She threw herself into helping Clara and the children, as if trying to scrub away the stain of her reputation with hard work. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was bleeding across the horizon. The children, Clara's 3 and June's son, David, were playing a game of tag in the wide, dusty yard between the cabin and the barn. Their laughter, which had become a welcome sound at the ranch, echoed in the clear air. Elias was oiling a piece of tack on the porch, a rare moment of peace settling over him, when he saw a figure approaching on the road. It was Josiah, the preacher's son, a boy of about 10 with his father's pious scowl and mean, narrow-set eyes. He stopped at the edge of the property, his hands behind his back. "What are you playing?" he called out, his voice dripping with false friendliness. Samuel, ever the diplomat, answered him. "Just tag. You want to play?" Josiah smirked. "I don't play with heathens." He looked directly at David, who had stopped running and was watching him with a child's open curiosity. Josiah's hand came from behind his back, and Elias saw the jagged rock in his fist. "My PA says your ma is a whore. He says she lays with savages and drives men to their graves." The words, adult in their cruelty, were a shocking violence in the quiet evening. Before anyone could react, Josiah's arm whipped forward. The rock flew through the air, striking David on the shoulder. The little boy cried out, stumbling back more from shock than pain. Clara's boys froze, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. "Son of a whore!" Josiah shrieked, his voice cracking with righteous fury. He hurled another rock, this one striking Samuel in the leg. "Don't you ever come near God's house? You're all unclean." That was all it took. A roar of pure, untamed rage erupted from Elias's chest. He was off the porch and clearing the distance in a matter of seconds, his face a thunderous mask. The preacher's son saw him coming and his bravado vanished, replaced by stark terror. He turned and fled, screaming as if the devil himself were on his heels. Elias didn't chase him. He stopped, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body trembling. June and Clara rushed out, gathering the crying, frightened children. June knelt, pulling David into her arms, her face a pale mask of anguish. She wasn't looking at her son's shoulder. She was looking at the invisible wound that had just been torn open in his heart. The shame the town had forced upon her was now being heaped upon her child. Elias looked at June's face, at the tears welling in her eyes, and the cold stone of his anger became a white-hot fire. He turned without a word and strode toward his horse. "Elias, where are you going?" Clara called, her voice frantic. "To see a man about his son," he bit out, swinging himself into the saddle. He rode into Harmony Creek as if he were riding into war. The last light of day was fading, and lamps were beginning to glow in the windows. He rode directly to the small, white-steepled church at the end of the main street. He dismounted and threw the doors open with a crash that echoed in the empty nave. Reverend Miller was at the pulpit, arranging his notes for the next sermon. He looked up, his expression one of annoyance at the interruption. "Thorne, what is the meaning of this?" the preacher demanded, his voice accustomed to absolute authority within these walls. "Your boy, Josiah," Elias said, his voice dangerously low as he stalked down the aisle. "He came to my home. He threw rocks at my family, at children." The Reverend's face tightened. "My son is a good, God-fearing boy. If he acted out, he must have been provoked by the company you keep. He called June Abbott a whore. He called her son a name no child should ever hear." Elias growled, stopping directly in front of the pulpit. "You taught him that. Those are your words, coming out of his mouth." "That woman's sin is a matter of public record," the preacher said, puffing out his chest. "It is my duty to protect the flock from her corrupting influence, and yours." Elias looked up at the man, at his soft hands that had never known a day of real labor, at his smug, self-satisfied face, and all the rage he had held in check for weeks finally broke free. "You're a hypocrite and a coward," he said, his voice shaking with contempt. "You hide behind that book and teach your own son to be cruel. You're not a man of God. You're just a man who likes to watch other people suffer." "How dare you?" the preacher began, his face turning purple. Elias didn't let him finish. He reached up, grabbed a handful of the preacher's starched shirt, and pulled him forward. Then he drew back his fist and drove it squarely into the Reverend's jaw. The crack of bone on bone was a sacrilege in the holy silence. The preacher crumpled, falling back against the pulpit with a shocked grunt, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. Elias stood over him, breathing heavily, the fire in his veins slowly turning to ice. He had just punched the most powerful man in town, in God's own house. He turned and walked out, leaving the Reverend sputtering on the floor. The news spread through Harmony Creek like a wildfire. By the next morning, he was the town's #1 villain. The story was that the devil himself, Elias Thorne, had stormed the church and assaulted the Reverend for daring to speak the truth about the harlot he was keeping. Sheriff Brody met him as he was leaving the general store. Brody was a decent man, practical and world-weary, a man who preferred to let things settle on their own. But this, he couldn't ignore. "Elias," he said, his voice low, "I need you to come by my office." In the small, dusty office, the sheriff leaned back in his chair, the tin star on his chest looking tarnished in the dim light. "I'm not going to arrest you, Elias. I know Miller can be a sanctimonious fool, but you can't go around punching preachers. The whole town is in an uproar. You're making this harder on yourself." "He called his son's cruelty God's work," Elias said, his voice flat. The sheriff sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Listen to me. As a friend, you're defending the wrong woman. June Abbott. She's got a cloud over her, right or wrong. It doesn't matter. That's just the way it is. You keep standing with her, and that cloud is going to cover you too. You'll lose everything." Elias stood up, his gaze steady and clear. He looked directly at the man of the law, the enforcer of the town's rules. No one is wrong for wanting to live a decent life. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "not me and not her." He walked out of the office, leaving the sheriff staring after him. He rode home under a sky that was turning a bruised, heavy gray. When he got back to the ranch, he found June in the barn, silently milking the cow. Her face was pale, and he could see she'd been crying. "It's my fault," she whispered, not looking at him. "All of this. I should go. I'll take David and I'll—" He didn't let her finish. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms. She was stiff at first, then she sagged against him, a shuddering sob breaking from her. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, his chin resting on top of her head. "This is not your fault," he said, his voice fierce. "This is their fault, theirs and their small, ugly minds." He held her at arm's length, forcing her to look at him, his hands framing her tear-streaked face. "They don't see you, June. They don't see you the way I see you." The next day, a heavy, oppressive stillness hung in the air. The sky was the color of slate, and the clouds were gathering over the mountains to the west, promising a long overdue rain. Their firewood was running low, and the threat of an autumn storm made the task urgent. "I'm going up the mountain," Elias said, "to the old logging trail. There's plenty of downed pine up there." "I'll come with you," June said immediately. "I can help load the wagon." He started to object, but he saw the look in her eyes. She needed to do something, to feel useful, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the ranch. He nodded, and they set off, the wagon wheels creaking in the eerie silence. They worked for hours, the rhythmic sound of his axe and the rasp of the saw filling the mountain air. They didn't talk much, but they worked together in a comfortable, efficient rhythm, a silent team against the wilderness. The higher they climbed, the thicker the clouds became, and the air grew cold and heavy with moisture. It started with a few stray drops, then a low rumble of thunder echoed through the canyon. Within minutes, the heavens opened up. It wasn't rain, it was a deluge, a solid sheet of cold, driving water that soaked them to the skin in seconds. The horses grew spooked, and the trail was quickly turning to a muddy river. "There's an old line shack," Elias shouted over the roar of the storm. "Up ahead, we have to take cover." He grabbed her hand, and they abandoned the wagon. Scrambling up a rocky incline, he half pulled, half carried her the last few yards to a small, dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging and its door hanging from a single leather hinge. They stumbled inside, gasping for breath, the storm raging behind them. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp earth and old pine. They were both soaked, their clothes plastered to their bodies, their hair dripping. June was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. Elias looked at her pale face and the vulnerability in her eyes, and the last of his restraint shattered. The whispers of the town, the preacher's fist, the sheriff's warning, all of it faded away, replaced by a single, overwhelming need. He stepped toward her, and she looked up, her eyes wide in the gloom. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb brushing the water from her cheek. "June," he breathed, and it was the only word he could manage. A raw, desperate hunger, born of loneliness and weeks of suppressed emotion, surged between them. It was in his eyes, a dark fire, and it was in hers, a mirror of his own need. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her cold hand coming up to cover his. That was all the invitation he needed. His mouth came down on hers, hard and demanding. It was nothing like their first, gentle kiss. This was a kiss of desperation, of two people finding an anchor in a storm. It was wet and cold and tasted of rain and a fierce, undeniable wanting. She answered him with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, her body pressing against his. They clung to each other, two soaked and shivering souls, finding a desperate warmth in the friction of their bodies, the heat of their mouths. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the driest corner of the shack, where a pile of old, musty straw lay. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers. There were no words, only the roar of the rain on the tin roof and the ragged sound of their breathing. In the dim light, he saw not a fallen woman, but his rescuer, his partner, the other half of his own lonely heart. What followed was not a taking, but a giving, an act of profound and tender intimacy. It was fierce and passionate, a release of all the pain and anger and fear they had endured. But it was also gentle, a slow, sacred exploration of two people who had been starved of kindness for far too long. He worshipped her with his hands, his mouth rediscovering a landscape of soft skin and quiet strength. She met his tenderness with a raw, unguarded vulnerability, offering up the trust she had given to no other man. As the storm raged outside, a fragile light began to filter through the cracks in the cabin walls. Thin, silver beams pierced the gloom, illuminating a stray curl of her hair, the graceful line of her shoulder, the tears that traced silent paths down her temples. It was not the harsh, judging light of the sun, but a soft, forgiving light, as if nature itself were blessing this stolen, sacred moment. In that small, broken-down shack, surrounded by the tempest, they were not outcasts. They were the only two people in the world, finding not just shelter, but salvation in each other's arms. They returned from the mountain changed. The storm had washed away the last of their reservations, leaving behind a bond forged in the heart of the tempest. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not changed. In a place like Harmony Creek, secrets were a currency, and the town's speculators were always watching. It took less than a month for the whispers to begin again, this time with a new, more venomous edge. It started with Clara. She saw it first, in the way June would turn pale and unsteady in the mornings, in the quiet, private bouts of sickness she tried to hide. Clara, who had borne 3 children, recognized the signs with a sad, knowing certainty. And if Clara could see it, it was only a matter of time before the rest of the town did. The rumor started, as it always did, in the fertile soil of the general store. A sharp-eyed woman noticed June's subtle sickness. She saw the protective way Elias now stood by her, the fierce tenderness in his gaze. She added two and two and came up with a story that was far more exciting than the truth. The story spread, mutating with each telling, until it was an established fact in the town's cruel mythology. The fallen widow, June Abbott, was pregnant, and the child, they whispered with a self-righteous sneer, was Elias Thorne's. The old lie about her and the native man was resurrected and twisted into this new narrative. "What can you expect?" they would say over their sewing circles. "First a savage, now a fool who'll defend her. That child won't know who its real father is." The unborn baby was condemned before it had even drawn its first breath. The whispers soon escalated to acts of open hostility. One morning, Elias found a piece of paper tucked under the door of his cabin. On it, written in crude, blocky letters, were the words, "Whore's spawn not welcome here." It was the first of several. The anonymous letters became a regular torment, each one a fresh drop of poison meant to infect their fragile happiness. The weight of it all began to press down on them, but it was June who bore the heaviest load. Elias was a man, and a formidable one. They might whisper behind his back, but few dared to confront him. June, however, was a woman with a ruined name, an easy and defenseless target. The hatred was a physical thing, a force that met her whenever she had to venture into town, a wall of cold shoulders and vicious glares. One evening, Elias came into the cabin to find Clara waiting for him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of anger. June and the boys were out by the barn. "This has gone far enough, Elias," she said, her voice a low, furious hiss. "Did you think this through at all? Did you think of her?" "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though he knew perfectly well. "Don't you lie to me," she snapped. "I see how they look at her. I see the notes you try to burn before anyone can read them. She's carrying your child, isn't she?" Elias met her gaze, his own jaw tight. "Yes." Clara let out a bitter, frustrated sound. "My God, Elias, you're a good man, but you're a fool. You think your love is enough to protect her from all this? You think you can punch the whole world in the mouth? You can't. And every stone they throw, every ugly word they say, she's the one it hits the hardest. You're putting it all on her shoulders." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow because he knew they were true. He had been so focused on his own righteous anger, on his love for June, that he hadn't fully considered the terrible weight of the public crucifixion she was enduring. But the next day, when a woman from a neighboring ranch rode up to the cabin on the pretense of borrowing some sugar, her eyes avid with greedy curiosity, it was Clara who met her at the door. "We don't have any to spare," she said, her voice as cold and hard as a winter stone, and shut the door in the woman's shocked face. From that moment on, Clara became June's fierce, silent guardian, a lioness protecting her pride, doing everything in her power to shield her from the prying, hateful eyes of the world. Despite their efforts, the poison found its way in. June grew more withdrawn, the light in her eyes dimming until it was barely a flicker. She would spend hours staring out the window, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, a look of profound sorrow on her face. She felt like a disease, a blight that was ruining the life of the one man who had ever shown her true kindness. The town's hatred was a burden she could bear. The thought that she was the cause of Elias's own ruin was an agony that was slowly crushing her spirit. The decision, when it came, was born of a desperate, selfless love. She waited for a night when a storm was brewing, the sky a turbulent sea of black and gray clouds. Elias and Clara were in the barn, tending to a sick calf. She scribbled a hasty note on a scrap of paper, her tears blurring the ink. She packed a small bag with a loaf of bread and a blanket. She kissed each of the sleeping boys on the forehead, her heart breaking with each soft touch. Then she slipped out of the cabin and into the wind, a ghost disappearing into the growing darkness. When Elias came back inside, the strange silence of the cabin hit him immediately. "June?" he called out. There was no answer. He saw the folded piece of paper on the table, his name written on it in her delicate, trembling hand. A cold dread seized him. He unfolded it, his heart pounding against his ribs. "My dearest Elias, please do not be angry. I am doing the only thing I can. You have given me more kindness than I have ever known, and I cannot bear to be the reason for your ruin. I will not let them hate you because of me. Please, do not look for me. Live your life in peace. I will love you always." June. The words blurred before his eyes. The air left his lungs in a ragged gasp. He crumpled the note in his fist, a primal roar of denial tearing from his throat. He burst out of the cabin, his eyes wild. The first drops of rain were beginning to fall, fat and cold. "She's gone!" he yelled to Clara, who was just leaving the barn. "She's left!" He didn't wait for a response. He ran to the corral, saddling his horse with frantic, clumsy movements. The wind was whipping into a frenzy, and the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the yard to mud. He swung himself into the saddle and dug his heels into the horse's flanks, launching them into the teeth of the storm. He had no idea which way she had gone, but he rode for the mountains. It was their place. He prayed it was where she would seek shelter. The world dissolved into a howling chaos of wind and water. Rain blinded him, and the trail became a treacherous, rushing stream. He pushed the horse onward, his mind a maelstrom of fear and rage. Fear for her, alone in this tempest, and rage at the town that had driven her to this. He came to the creek that was usually a gentle, ankle-deep stream. Tonight, it was a raging brown torrent, filled with debris. There was no time to find another crossing. He urged his terrified horse into the churning water. They fought against the current, the horse struggling for footing on the slick, rocky bottom. They were halfway across when a large log, carried by the flood, slammed into the horse's legs. The animal screamed, losing its balance and going down. Elias was thrown into the icy water. He was submerged, the current tumbling him over and over, his lungs burning. He fought his way to the surface, gasping for air, and saw his horse scrambling onto the far bank. Alive but panicked, he swam with all his might, his arms and legs leaden, and finally clawed his way onto the muddy bank. Collapsing in exhaustion, his hand was on fire. He looked down and saw a deep, ragged gash across his palm where he had grabbed for a sharp rock. Blood streamed from the wound, mixing with the rain and mud. He didn't care. He staggered to his feet, his body bruised and battered, and caught his trembling horse. He pulled himself back into the saddle, his bloody hand leaving a smear on the pommel, and pushed onward, deeper into the storm-ravaged mountains. He searched for what felt like an eternity, his voice raw from shouting her name into the wind. He was soaked to the bone, shivering, his injured hand throbbing with a dull, persistent pain. Despair began to creep in, a cold more piercing than the rain. Then, through the deluge, he saw it, a faint, familiar landmark, a peculiar outcropping of rock near a shallow cave, a place they had once sheltered from a sudden summer shower, laughing as they waited for the sun to return. He slid from the saddle and stumbled toward the opening, his heart in his throat. He peered into the darkness, his eyes struggling to adjust, and then he saw her. She was huddled in the far back corner of the cave, wrapped in her thin blanket, her knees drawn up to her chest. She looked small and lost, a fragile thing against the immense, ancient stone. "June!" he croaked, his voice a raw whisper. She looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked in the gloom. The sight of him, soaked, muddy, bleeding, made her gasp. She started to rise. He staggered forward and fell to his knees before her on the cold, damp ground. He was too exhausted to stand, too overwhelmed to speak. He simply knelt there, his head bowed, the rain and blood dripping from his hand onto the cave floor. "Don't go," he finally managed to say, his voice breaking. "Please, don't leave me." He looked up at her, his face a mask of raw, desperate pleading. "They are wrong. The whole damn world can be wrong. But not you. Never you. Tears began to stream down June's face, silent and unstoppable. She saw not the strong, quiet cowboy, but a man brought to his knees by his love for her. All the walls she had built around her heart crumbled into dust. "I'm not leaving because of them," she cried, her voice thick with a pain that went deeper than any insult the town could hurl at her. "I'm leaving because of you." He looked at her, confused. "Because I love you, Elias," she sobbed, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. "I love you so much, and I'm so afraid I'm not worthy of you. I'm afraid my past will poison your future forever. I'm a ruined woman, and I can't bear to watch you be ruined, too." His heart broke and healed all in the same instant. He reached for her, his movements clumsy with exhaustion and emotion. He pulled her down to her knees in front of him, his bloody hand coming up to cup her face, smearing her cheek with mud and blood. "Don't you ever say that," he whispered fiercely, his eyes boring into hers. "You are not ruined. You are the strongest, kindest person I have ever known. You are my future. June." He pulled her to him and kissed her, a kiss of desperation and relief, of pain and of profound, earth-shattering love. He poured all of his fear, all of his devotion, all of his promises into that single, desperate act. He held her tight in the dark, damp cave, the storm raging outside like a forgotten world, in that raw, primal place, surrounded by the ancient stone of the mountain. He held on to her as if she were the only real thing he had ever known, a silent, unbreakable vow to never, ever let her go. When they rode back down from the mountain, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet pine and damp earth. Something had settled between them in that cave, a truth as solid and enduring as the stone that had sheltered them. They were no longer two separate, lonely souls battling the world. They were a single, unified front, and that, more than anything, is what the town of Harmony Creek saw. Their return was not met with fanfare or apology. The wall of prejudice had been built over a year of gossip and lies, and it would not crumble in a day. But for the first time, there were cracks in the foundation. The change was not in the town as a whole, but in the quiet, individual moments. It began with the children. Samuel, Jacob, and Caleb refused to stop playing with David, their simple, childish loyalty a rebuke to the complex hatred of their elders. Soon, a few other children, braver than their parents, joined their games in Elias's yard, their laughter a small but persistent rebellion. Then came those June had helped, a rancher named Peterson, whose wife had been cured of a lingering fever by one of June's herbal remedies, tipped his hat to her in the street. His wife sent over a freshly baked loaf of bread, a silent offering of gratitude. The old woman, Martha, who lived by the well, would now greet them with a knowing smile, her presence a small, steady beacon of support. These were not grand gestures, but they were everything. They were whispers of acceptance in a town that had only ever shouted condemnation. Elias and June held on to these small kindnesses like embers, carefully nurturing them against the still chilling wind of the town's general opinion. Then the land itself turned against them. The rains that had saved them in the mountains vanished. Spring bled into a summer of relentless, brutal heat. The sky became a vast, empty bowl of polished brass. Day after day, week after week. The creek that ran past the edge of town shrank, its song fading to a dry whisper before it disappeared entirely, leaving a cracked, serpentine scar in the earth. The grass in the pastures turned from green to gold, then to a brittle, lifeless brown. It was a drought, the likes of which the region had not seen in a generation. It was a slow, creeping disaster that settled over the valley like a shroud. Cattle, their ribs stark beneath their hides, grew weak, their lowing a constant, mournful sound of suffering. Dust was the new air they breathed, a fine red powder that coated everything, gritting in their food, their water, their teeth. The wells in town ran low, and the water that was pulled up was brackish and thin. Fear, a far more potent poison than gossip, began to take root in Harmony Creek. People grew gaunt and irritable, their faces etched with the same desperate worry. One evening, as the sun set in a hazy, smoke-red sky, Elias and June stood on their porch, looking out at the parched, dying land. June's pregnancy was beginning to show, a gentle, hopeful curve that seemed a defiance against the barrenness all around them. "The arroyo," June said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. "At the north end of your property. The bedrock is close to the surface there." Elias looked at her, confused. "It's as dry as everything else." "Now, yes," she said, her eyes distant, her mind clearly working. "But when the rains do come, all the water from this side of the valley funnels through there, a flash flood. Gone in an hour. We watch it wash away every year." She turned to him, her gaze intense. "What if we didn't let it? What if we built something to hold it?" He slowly began to understand the scale of what she was suggesting. "A cistern? A reservoir? June, that would take 12 men a month to build." "Then we need to find 12 men," she said simply. "We could dig it out, line it with clay from the creek bed, reinforce it with stone, a basin big enough to hold enough water to last through a dry season. For everyone." The sheer audacity of her idea stunned him. She was proposing that the very town that had cast her out, that had tried to destroy her, should now come together on her land to save themselves. She was offering grace to people who had only ever shown her cruelty. The next day, they rode into town. A grim, worried crowd was gathered outside the general store, their talk bleak and hopeless. Elias hitched the wagon, and he and June walked into the center of the group. A hostile silence fell. Elias spoke, his voice clear and steady. "We're all in trouble. The land is dying, and so are the cattle. Waiting for rain isn't a plan." A rancher named Cobb, a man who had been one of June's most vocal detractors, sneered. "And what do you suggest, Thorne? You got some special connection to the Almighty now that you're shacked up with her?" Before Elias' anger could flare, June stepped forward. She was not intimidated by their hostile glares. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a quiet authority that made them listen. She laid out her plan, not as a plea, but as a practical, logical solution. She spoke of the arroyo, the bedrock, the flow of water. She spoke of clay and stone and shared labor. "On Elias's land?" someone scoffed. "So he can control the water and charge us for it?" Elias stepped forward then, standing shoulder to shoulder with June. His gaze swept over the crowd, his expression hard as granite. "The work will be for everyone who is willing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And the water will be for everyone who is thirsty. My land is your land for this. We survive this together, or we watch everything we've built turn to dust alone." There was a long, tense silence. They looked from Elias's unyielding face to June's quiet, determined one. They looked at their own dusty boots, at the worried faces of their neighbors. It was Martha, the old woman from the well, who broke the silence. "The girl's got more sense than all you fools put together," she rasped. "I'm old, but I can carry water for the mortar." Her words broke the spell, one by one. Then, in small groups, men began to nod, their pride warring with their desperation. The need to survive was a more powerful force than old hatreds. That afternoon, a small group of them followed Elias's wagon out to the arroyo. The work had begun. For 2 weeks, they labored under the merciless, white-hot sun. It was brutal, back-breaking work. They dug into the baked earth with picks and shovels, their bodies slick with sweat, their lungs caked with dust. At first, the crew was small, a handful of desperate men. But as the days passed and the last of the wells in town ran dry, more came. They came with their own tools and their own grim determination, their old animosities burned away by the shared, grueling task. June was there from sunup to sundown. She was pregnant, but she worked harder than any of them. She directed the sourcing of the clay, her knowledge of the earth unerring. She hauled buckets of water from their own dwindling well to mix the mortar. She tended to the cuts and scrapes of the men, applying herbal salves that soothed the pain. She did not give orders. She led by example, her quiet resilience a constant, steadying presence. The men who had once called her names now watched her with a grudging respect. They saw her strength, her intelligence, her unwavering spirit. They saw her sharing her own family's precious water with the work crew, her ladle filling the cup of the very man who had once accused her of witchcraft. The wall of prejudice didn't so much crumble as it dissolved, turning to dust under the heat of the sun and the sweat of shared labor. They finished on a Tuesday. The cistern was a massive, ugly scar in the earth, a testament to their desperation and their hope. It was 50 feet across and 10 feet deep, lined with a thick layer of puddled clay and reinforced with a stone wall. It was empty. They all stood at the edge, looking down into the gaping hole, their bodies aching, their hopes hanging by a thread. The sky above remained stubbornly, cruelly blue. The rain came that night. It started just after midnight, with a low rumble of thunder that sounded like a promise. Then came the smell, that beautiful life-giving scent of rain on dry, thirsty earth. And then the drops began to fall. Not a gentle shower, but a biblical deluge, a torrential downpour that hammered on the roof of the cabin and turned the dusty world to mud. Elias and June stood on their porch, holding hands, their faces turned up to the sky, letting the cool, clean water wash over them. All across the valley, families were doing the same, a collective sigh of relief rising up to meet the storm. The next morning, the world was reborn. The air was clean, the dust was gone, and the land looked dark and rich. Elias and June walked to the arroyo. The sound reached them before they saw it. The roar of a flash flood, a torrent of brown water pouring down from the mountains. But this time, it was not washing away. It was pouring into their cistern, filling the great basin, until the water lapped near the top, a vast, shimmering pool of life. Word spread through the town. By midday, a line of wagons and people on foot stretched from the cistern back toward Harmony Creek. They came with barrels and buckets, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and relief. June stood by the cistern with a ladle and a bucket, and Elias stood beside her. One by one, they came forward. Rancher Cobb, the man who had sneered at them, was first. He held out his bucket, refusing to meet her eyes. June filled it for him. As he turned to leave, he stopped. "Thank you, ma'am," he muttered to the ground and hurried away. It was an apology. It was an absolution. They all came. The women who had whispered, the men who had glared. Each one received their water from her hand. Each one offered a quiet, humbled word of thanks. They had come to her for help, and she had given it without hesitation. She had saved them. In that long, quiet procession, June Abbott was no longer the town pariah. She was their salvation. A week later, a new preacher arrived in town. Reverend Miller had quietly packed his bags and left the day after the cistern was filled, unable to face the congregation he had so badly misled. The new man was named Reverend Blackwood. He was younger, with kind eyes and a face that seemed accustomed to smiling. He rode out to the ranch one afternoon and found Elias and June sitting on the porch. He dismounted and approached them, his hat in his hands. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Abbott," he said with a polite nod. "My name is Samuel Blackwood. I'm the new pastor for Harmony Creek." "Reverend," Elias said, his voice neutral but not unfriendly. "I've been in town for 3 days," Blackwood continued, "and I've heard a great many stories. I've heard stories of hardship and of prejudice." He looked directly at June, his gaze gentle and respectful. And I've heard the story of a great drought, and of a woman with the wisdom and the grace to save a town that didn't deserve her. He took a breath. I'm not a man who concerns himself with the past. The good book tells us to look forward, to build a better community based on forgiveness and good works. It seems to me that you two have already begun that work here. He paused, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. I don't care who you were, or what stories people used to tell. I only want to ask. He looked from June to Elias, his eyes shining with sincerity. Would I have the honor of performing the wedding ceremony for you two? The wedding was not held in the church with its stained glass windows and rigid pews. It took place on a bright, clear afternoon on their own land, beside the great stone and clay cistern that had become the heart of the valley. This was their cathedral, a place built not of doctrine and judgment, but of sweat, desperation, and finally, of shared hope. The water within it shimmered under the autumn sun, a vast, placid mirror reflecting the endless blue sky. The whole town did not attend, but the whole town knew it was happening. Those who came were the ones who mattered. Clara, her face beaming with a joy that made her look like the young girl Elias remembered. Old Martha, wrapped in her finest shawl, her wrinkled face a mask of proud satisfaction. The Peterson family, their children scrubbed and shining, and a handful of other ranchers and their wives. People who had come to respect the quiet strength of the couple standing before them. June did not have a new dress. She wore a simple white gown that had once been her mother's, a garment yellowed with age and stored away with sad memories. But in Clara's skilled hands, it had been reborn. Clara had worked for a week, carefully replacing the worn lace, mending the delicate seams, and fitting it to June's pregnant form until it looked as if it had been made just for her. Standing there in the sunlight, with a wreath of late-blooming wildflowers in her hair, June was not just beautiful, she was radiant, a woman who had finally found her safe harbor. Elias stood beside her, his hand holding hers. He wore no suit, only his best shirt, washed and pressed by Clara until it was crisp and white, and his old trousers, brushed clean of the ranch's perpetual dust. The change in him was not in his clothes, but in his eyes. For the first time in years, the haunted, solitary watchfulness was gone, replaced by a clear, steady light. The deep lines of worry around his mouth had softened. He looked at June as if she were the only person in the world, his world, and the sight of her filled him with a profound, bone-deep peace he had never known. Reverend Blackwood's voice was warm and kind, his words simple and direct, speaking not of sin and damnation, but of forgiveness, partnership, and the quiet courage it takes to build a life in a hard land. When it was time for the rings, 2 simple bands of gold Elias had traded 3 of his best cattle for, a sweet, clumsy procession began. Samuel, the oldest of Clara's boys, walked forward solemnly, carrying the rings on a small, embroidered pillow. Jacob followed, clutching a handful of flower petals that he threw with more enthusiasm than grace. And little Caleb, the youngest, simply toddled after them, a wide, happy grin on his face. Reverend Blackwood took the rings and was about to proceed when another small figure stepped forward. It was David, June's son. He had been standing quietly beside Clara, but now he walked to Elias and stopped, looking up at the tall, quiet man who had become his protector. He hesitated for a moment, his small face a study in childish gravity. Then, he reached out and wrapped his arms around Elias's legs, hugging him tight. "Pa?" he asked, his small voice carrying in the respectful silence. "Can I call you that?" A collective breath was drawn from the small crowd. Elias froze, his hand hovering in the air. He looked down at the top of the boy's head, at this child who had endured so much cruelty, who was now asking for the one thing he had never had. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled his knees washed over him. He had never been a father. He had never thought he would be. But in that moment, he knew it was the only thing he had ever truly wanted to be. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He knelt, his knees cracking, until he was at eye level with the boy. He pulled him into a fierce, gentle hug, burying his face in the child's soft hair. He couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, so he just nodded, again and again. That evening, the ranch was quiet. The guests had departed, leaving behind the pleasant scent of wood smoke and leftover cake. Clara had taken the 4 boys into town to spend the night with the Peterson family, a gesture of profound and knowing grace. For the first time, Elias and June were truly alone in the cabin that was now their home. Their wedding night was not a thing of silks or finery. It was a thing of rustic, simple beauty. A single candle flickered on the nightstand, its soft, golden light dancing on the rough-hewn wooden walls. Outside, the crickets sang their timeless, hypnotic song, a peaceful chorus under a canopy of brilliant stars. They sat on the edge of the bed, the clean, crisp sheets smelling faintly of lavender that Clara had tucked among them. They didn't speak for a long time. There were no words for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Elias reached out and took her hand. His was large, calloused, and scarred from a life of hard labor and a desperate ride through a storm. Hers was slender and delicate, but possessed a quiet, resilient strength. Their fingers intertwined. He saw that her hand was trembling, and then realized that his was, too. It was not a tremor of fear, but of reverence, of 2 souls standing on a sacred threshold. "June Thorne," he whispered, testing the sound of her new name. It sounded right. It sounded like it had been her name all along. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the candlelight. "Elias," she answered, her voice soft with an emotion that needed no other words. The act of their love that night was a quiet, holy thing. It was not the desperate, frantic coupling of the storm-tossed cabin, a search for warmth and anchor. This was a slow, deliberate affirmation of their vows, a physical manifestation of the trust and commitment they had pledged to each other beside the water. It was an act of profound healing. For Elias, it was the breaking down of the last walls around his solitary heart, a surrender to a love he had long ago given up on. For June, it was a rediscovery of what it meant to be touched with tenderness, with respect, with a love that sought only to give, not to take. His touch was not a violation, but a prayer. His kiss was not a demand, but a promise. In the quiet, candlelit intimacy of their cabin, they washed away the last of the scars from their pasts, finding in each other's arms not just passion, but a deep and abiding peace. They were finally home. The next morning, they awoke to the sun streaming through the window and the sound of a rooster crowing. When Elias opened the cabin door, he stopped in his tracks. On their porch, a collection of small gifts had been left. It seemed the entire town had walked by in the quiet hours of the dawn. There was a large jug of fresh milk, a basket of still warm bread, a crock of butter, and several jars of preserves. Someone had left a pile of brightly colored, hand-sewn quilts, and all around, tucked into baskets and jars, were bunches of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a celebration of the valley's return to life. As Elias stood there, taking it all in, he saw a figure at the edge of the property. It was Rancher Cobb, the man who had been the first to sneer and the last to join the building of the cistern. He was carrying a small basket. He walked hesitantly to the porch steps, his gaze fixed on the ground. He set the basket down. It was full of fresh eggs. And then he looked up, his eyes meeting Elias's for a brief, telling moment. Cobb's face was a mixture of shame and respect. He said nothing. He simply dipped his head in a short, formal bow, a gesture of profound apology and deference. Then he turned and walked away. Elias watched him go, a sense of finality settling over him. It was over. The fight was won. The seasons turned. The last of autumn's gold gave way to the quiet, white blanket of winter. And then, finally, to the vibrant, explosive promise of spring. The land around the ranch came alive. The pastures, once brown and brittle, were now a carpet of lush, green grass. The creek gurgled happily, its banks dotted with yellow buttercups. New calves, wobbly-legged and curious, followed their mothers through the fields. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming sage and fertile earth. The ranch, which had for so long been a place of solitude and hardship, was now a place of life, of laughter, of family. It was as if the land itself was mirroring the transformation in their own lives. Their past had been a long, hard drought, but the rains had come, and everything, everywhere, was green again. A year passed, a year of quiet, steady healing. The seasons turned with a gentle rhythm, each one knitting the fabric of their new life a little tighter. The ranch prospered. The town settled into a new kind of peace, and June's belly grew with the promise of new life. In the late summer, when the fields were golden with ripe hay and the air was thick with the scent of sun-baked earth, June gave birth to a daughter. They named her Lily. She was a small, perfect thing with a tuft of dark hair like Elias's and eyes as green as a springtime meadow, just like her mother's. The news of her birth traveled not as a scandalous whisper, but as a joyful announcement. And the town came, not all at once, but in a slow, steady stream over the following week. They made the pilgrimage to the Thorn Ranch. They came in wagons and on horseback, their faces, once pinched with suspicion, now open with genuine warmth. The women who had once crossed the street to avoid June now crowded into the small cabin, their arms laden with gifts. They brought bundles of soft flannel, jars of milk from their best cows, and small, hand-carved wooden toys. They cooed over the baby, their rough, work-worn hands surprisingly gentle as they touched Lily's soft cheek. Mrs. Peterson, the rancher's wife whom June had nursed back to health, brought a beautifully stitched baby blanket, its colors as vibrant as the wildflowers by the creek. Even Rancher Cobb's wife came, a shy, humbled woman who pressed a jar of honey into June's hands and whispered, "She's a blessing, a true blessing for us all." Elias stood back and watched, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. He saw these people, the same people who had condemned June, now gathered in his home to celebrate her. He saw their faces, and the genuine happiness there, and he understood. It wasn't just about the cistern. June hadn't just brought them water. She had shown them a different way to be. She had absorbed their hatred and returned it with a quiet, unwavering grace that had, in the end, shamed them all into being better people. One afternoon, he stood on the porch, watching the chaotic, beautiful spectacle of his life. The 5 children, his 3 nephews, his stepson, and now his own tiny daughter sleeping in a cradle just inside the door, were a whirlwind of noise and motion in the yard. Samuel was teaching David how to properly skip a stone. Jacob and Caleb were chasing chickens, their shrieks of laughter echoing in the clear air. June came to stand beside him, her body weary but her face serene, leaning her head against his shoulder. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. He watched the boys for a long moment, a scene of such simple, profound happiness it almost hurt to look at. "You did this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Before you came, this place was just land and wood. It was quiet. It had no spirit." He looked down at her, his gaze full of a love so deep it needed few words. "You brought a new heart to this place. June, you gave it a soul." Their peace was interrupted a few weeks later by a letter. It arrived with the mail rider, a crisp, clean envelope that looked jarringly out of place. It was addressed to Clara. She read it, her face slowly draining of all color. It was from her husband, Garrett. He was in a town 100 miles east. He had heard of their survival. He wrote, his venture with the other woman had failed, and he was filled with a deep and abiding regret. He wanted his family back. He wanted his sons. He would be arriving in 2 days' time to collect them. Clara crumpled the letter, her body trembling with a mixture of old fear and new rage. "He can't," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He has no right." Elias took the crumpled letter from her hand and smoothed it out. He read the slick, self-pitying words, and a cold, hard calm settled over him. "Don't you worry, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of anger, full of an unshakable resolve. "I'll handle this." 2 days later, a handsome, well-dressed man rode up to the ranch on a fine-looking horse. He had a salesman's smile and eyes that were constantly assessing, calculating. He dismounted and strode toward the cabin as if he owned it. Elias met him on the porch. He didn't invite him to sit. He simply stood there, blocking the doorway, a quiet, immovable object. "You must be the brother," Garrett said, his smile unwavering. "Elias, is it? I'm Garrett. I've come for my boys." "They're not your boys anymore," Elias said, his voice flat. Garrett's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Now, see here. I am their father. The law is on my side. I made a mistake. I admit it. But a man has a right to his own family. You gave up that right when you abandoned them in the dust with $20 and a half-dead horse," Elias replied, his gaze never leaving the other man's face. "You gave it up when you left them to starve or freeze, for all you knew or cared." "That's in the past," Garrett said, trying to regain his footing. "I'm a changed man. I can provide for them now. What can you offer them here? A dirt floor cabin and a life of breaking their backs on this useless piece of land." Elias didn't rise to the bait. He just stood there, his presence more powerful than any threat. He was the land. He was the rock. He was the deep, unshakable root that had held this family together. "I'll tell you what they have here," Elias said, his voice dropping even lower, carrying a weight that made Garrett take an involuntary step back. "They have a home. They have food in their bellies and a roof that doesn't leak. They have an uncle who loves them. They have a new aunt who cherishes them, and a new cousin to protect. They have a mother who has found her strength and who will never again be made to feel small by a man like you." He took a step forward, and for the first time, Garrett's composure cracked, a flicker of fear in his shifty eyes. "This family doesn't need you anymore," Elias said, the words a final, quiet judgment. "Get on your horse, ride away, and do not ever come back." Garrett looked past Elias, searching for an ally, for his wife, for his sons, but all he saw was a closed door. He looked at the unyielding man in front of him, and he knew he was defeated. There was no argument he could win here. He had no currency in this place of loyalty and honor. Without another word, he turned, mounted his fine horse, and rode away, a ghost from a past that no longer had any power. The town continued to change, to heal. One day, a small, simple monument appeared beside the old, abandoned well at the edge of town. No one knew exactly who put it there, though most suspected it was old Martha and a few of the other ranchers. It wasn't grand. It was a single, flat stone, painstakingly carved by an amateur hand. But the words on it were clear for all to see. Here stood a woman who was misunderstood, and a man who believed in her. It became a quiet landmark, a testament to the town's own long journey from prejudice to grace. It was a reminder that the worst kind of drought is not a lack of water, but a lack of compassion. The story ends, as so many do, on a quiet evening, with the sun setting in a blaze of glory. The sky was streaked with impossible colors, deep orange, fiery red, and the soft purple of a fading bruise. June stood on the porch, leaning back against Elias's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. Lily was asleep in her cradle inside, and the boys' tired, happy voices drifted from the barn where they were finishing their chores. A comfortable, peaceful silence settled between them, the kind that exists only between two people who know each other's souls completely. Elias rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the faint, sweet scent of her hair. He thought of the long, lonely years before she came, of the cold silence of his life. He thought of the night he had stood on her porch in the snow, his heart in his hands, terrified and hopeful. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for letting me try." June smiled, a soft, secret smile. She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, right over his steady, beating heart. She looked up at him, her green eyes full of a love that was as vast and as beautiful as the sunset behind them. "You don't have to try anymore, Elias," she said softly. "You are everything." Thank you so much for listening to this story. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from around the world. So please drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed our tale, consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this one. And feel free to share your thoughts. We appreciate every one of you